Hey there, welcome to Unit 2, Lesson 2. So remember that this unit is all about the oppression of people during the late 1800s, early 1900s, their reaction to that oppression, and then how the government started doing reforms to react to that as well. Today, our focus is going to be on women and what they were upset about and how they tried to make some changes for themselves. So we're going to start off by something that should be a little bit more of a review for or from American History 1. And that was that before the Civil War even happened, the women's rights movement really started in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. This is when a group of women and men that supported women's rights all got together and wrote down the things that they were really upset about, that they felt women deserved to be able to have. Now, the yellow questions on here during class, we would have done some waterfall questions here during the teams meeting. So I'm not going to obviously wait for you to respond or anything, but this question is, what are some of the things that women were upset about? So let's talk about those. Women weren't allowed to vote. Women weren't allowed to own property. Women were allowed to be abused by their husbands by law. That was totally fine. Women did not have the right to refuse sex. Women were held back from advancing educational opportunities. So the list goes on and on about the things that women were really upset about during this time period. So let's talk about women and their jobs, actually, since we just said something about education. So it was really difficult for women to get education, but some women had to go to the workplace. So typically speaking, your middle and upper class women didn't tend to get jobs. And if they did get jobs, they didn't have them for very long. They would start, some of them getting higher education, some of them going to universities and stuff like that, but most of them still didn't end up working. And when they did find a husband and get married, if they were working, they were expected to stop. Those that did get professional work tended to actually remain single and not go out and get married and have kids and stuff like that. And they were almost looked at as outcasts. You know, they weren't doing the things that women were supposed to be doing. Your lower class women didn't necessarily have the luxury of choosing to work or not. So lower class women that were low income, living in poverty, living in some of those urban areas, they had to go get work to help support their family. So young and single women would often find works in factories or working in clerical positions, like as a secretary, for example. Nursing became a very popular job for women to get as well. They oftentimes worked very, very long hours, 12 to 16 hours a day in very bad conditions. We'll talk more about those conditions tomorrow. And they were kind of treated as second class workers by their bosses. They weren't given the same respect that everybody else, that all of the men would be given. And they obviously weren't going to be given the same amount of pay either. When World War I comes, women do step up and go into the workplace a little bit more, but as soon as the war's over and the men come back from fighting, then the women kind of go back into their homes, and a lot of them don't continue to work after that. So as I said, women typically, excuse me, and this time period were not going to be working a lot, and when they were working, they weren't going to be making as much money. So in 1800, there were about 2.6 million women that were working nationwide. We're going to see that number grow, that by 1900 there are 8.6 million women held in jobs. Now you have to remember that the population also exploded during this time, so the percentage of women working didn't change that much, but the number of women did, because of the amount of immigration that happened in between 1800 and 1900. Typically speaking, as I said, these jobs were paid less than men who may have even been doing the exact same work. And a lot of times women in factories would have jobs like you see here, like women that are sewing. So they still did the skills that women were kind of expected to do. So let's talk about their role in the home. If they weren't working, women during this time, once they were married, were meant to be obedient to their husbands. They were meant to make sure they keep the home clean, and they were meant to raise the children. Obviously, this standard for women has continued for a very long amount of time, and a lot of women during this time are still accepting of it, but some of them are starting to say, this isn't what my life has to be. Why is this what I'm supposed to do? Why do I have to get married and my sole job is to raise children? Um, Along with some of those changing views include the changing views on sex and marriage. So, as I said earlier, in the things that women were upset about, they could be forced to have sex with their husbands. Like, there was no such thing as marital rape. If a husband wanted to have sex, he could force it to happen. And so the views of sex and the way that marriage is perceived starts to change during this time. And we start to see it becoming more on a good side about love and being romantic and people coming together. So people started really looking for more of a companion. You've got, these romantic novels being written at the time that are kind of sweeping people off their feet and saying, oh, I want that. I want to find my true love and stuff. And that a lot of marriages were women were saying, look, we need to be treated more like equals within this relationship. Wives were obviously desiring the ability to be able to refuse sex, which wasn't allowed, as I said just a few minutes ago. And women start pushing for men to be held to the same standards as them. Because, for example, if you were a woman and you had sex before you were married, then you could, be branded with not such a good name. But if you were a man and had sex before you were married, then you were just sowing your wild oats, and that's what you needed to do, and you deserve a high five for that. So women were upset with that double standard that obviously still a lot of times continues to exist today. So, speaking of sex, let's talk about this lady right here, Margaret Sanger. Today, we kind of take birth control for granted, like the idea that a woman can take birth control so that she can stop herself from being pregnant is very normal in our society now. But you need to know that at this time, that was not the case. So, this woman, Margaret Sanger, was actually arrested on multiple occasions for promoting contraceptives. Let me move myself out of here. So promoting contraceptives and the reproductive rights of women. She would distribute this information about birth control. She would teach women and couples how to try to not get pregnant and the things that they could do. She believed truly that the only way that women would ever actually be able to be considered equal to men is if they were able to be in control of their bodies and decide if they wanted to bear children. Now, keep in mind, this is not an abortion discussion that I'm talking about here. Margaret Sanger was actually a woman who was not in favor of abortion, but did believe in the idea that you should be able to decide when you want to have children. And so therefore you should be able to practice birth control. She created the American Birth Control League, which would later transform and become Planned Parenthood, which is what it is in its current state today, which is still around to offer services to women and be able to get birth control. So the next movement, so it wasn't just about the women wanting to have a say in terms of sex and being able to decide when they want to have children. Women got involved in a lot of other movements as well, one of them being the temperance movement. So the temperance movement was a big push by women to basically stop the consumption of alcohol. It began early in the 1800s, but it would continue to grow and become a mass movement by the late 1800s. Women were particularly involved because alcohol so often dominated their husbands' lives. They would go and spend all the money that they'd be making in the bars, and then they would also oftentimes experience increased domestic violence and beatings in the homes and stuff like that of both the children and the wives by drunk husbands that were coming home and being violent. And again, that was totally acceptable at this time. So women said, hey, if we get rid of the alcohol, maybe we get rid of this problem. Many men would go out because they were upset with the jobs and the working in the factories. And we did this when we talked about our urbanization thing, like bars and drinking just start popping up everywhere. And so this is a really big thing for women to push forward. In 1874, so later in the 1800s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed. So a whole group of women coming together focused on Christianity and stopping the consumption of alcohol. One of these women who really, really wanted to stop the consumption of alcohol was this awesome lady right here. She is a hoot. So this is Carrie Nation. You can see her in her picture here in the way that she would like for you to remember her, with a Bible in one hand and a hatchet in the other. She was a very radical member of that temperance union and would actually go out to bars and saloons and would attack them with that hatchet and just go in and kind of go like crazy and destroy and break as many bottles as she could. She was arrested on multiple occasions. Her first husband had died, if I remember correctly, from alcoholism. And so she was just very, very against people drinking alcohol. She described herself as a bulldog running at the feet of Jesus and barking at what he doesn't like. So she was just like an intense character. She was a pretty cool, pretty interesting lady. So the number one thing that people generally think of when they're like, okay, these are the things women are fighting for. They want equality. They want better pay for their jobs. They want men to stop drinking. The bigger picture is that they start focusing a lot on women having the right to vote, because if women can get the right to vote, then they can help to elect the people that will also make those decisions and make those changes that will help them out. So the 15th Amendment, as we talked about yesterday, said that vote couldn't be denied on race, but it didn't say anything about gender. And that disappointed a lot of women who felt that they also deserved the right to vote, that everybody, African-American men and all women, should be enfranchised at the same time together. Enfranchised means to be given the right to vote. So African-Americans themselves, though, tended to be split over whether or not women had the right to vote. So I'm going to show you a couple quotes here. The first is from a guy you're pretty familiar with, probably, called Frederick Douglass. You've been learning about him since elementary school. I know this because my kids have been learning about him recently. So Frederick Douglass, amazing man. Don't get me wrong. You got my little Bitmoji down here. And I'm like, I thought we were friends. Like, I'm kind of joking here. But the thing is that he said this. He said, when women, because they are women, are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed upon the pavement, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. And then somebody asks the question, but was this not true for Black women? And he responds, yes, 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 it is true for Black women that they are going through that. However, it is not because she is a woman. It is because she is Black. So his argument was that when women are going through the same troubles as Black Americans, then that's when they deserve the right to vote. But women aren't being attacked and killed like Black Americans are. So in class, we would have gone through and talked about that in a waterfall question, but I just went through and discussed it with you just now. So let's go to another person who you may be familiar with as well, by the name of Sojourner Truth, a very popular, famous African-American woman. So in 1869, she said this: there's a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women. And if the colored men get their rights and not the colored women theirs, you see the colored men will be the masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. So her argument is that she didn't want to necessarily trade one master after she's freed from slavery for another master, that women need to be able to get the right to vote as well. Otherwise, they're just going to have to now answer to their husbands and to other Black men within the community and not have a voice of their own. So with all of this said, you got to remember that other than Frederick Douglass, there are lots and lots of people who are against women getting the right to vote. So in class, we would have gone through this waterfall question, but ultimately it's to answer these things right here. So why did the anti-suffragists have these beliefs? Number one, they thought that extending the right to women was going to be really, really bad and that they shouldn't have it. So here's why. Women were too high strung. They were too irrational. They were too emotional. Women were not smart enough. They were not educated enough to be able to vote. Women's job was to stay at home, not to be out and active in politics. Women were too physically frail. Literally, it might tire them out just having to take on the stress of walking to the polling place to go and cast their vote. I mean, my eye roll cannot get any bigger here with this stuff. And then women, if they voted, would just become too masculine because they would get too involved in politics. And that's a man's world. And we don't want to take away the femininity from women. So These are all reasons that there were lots of people that were against women getting the right to vote. So let's talk about the early days of the women's suffrage movement versus the later days. And we're almost done with these notes. I know these are a little bit long, but just stick with me here. So before 1910, we had these two amazing ladies on the front lines working for the right to vote. We see the creation of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, who was going to be led by Susan B. Anthony and Katie Stanton, or Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So these two women really push for women to be able to get the right to vote, and they have some big strategies that they use. Number one, they want to try to go state by state. Let's convince the state of North Carolina to give women the right to vote. Let's convince the state of New York to give women the right to vote. Remember, we talked about in the last unit that some states were already doing this, especially out west. So they're like, hey, if we just go state by state, then everything will be good. Their second strategy was that after they could get some states to go ahead and pass it, then they could convince the whole nation to do it, and they could try to pass a constitutional amendment so that every woman in the country would be able to vote. That was going to be a difficult task because that's going to take 36 states to ratify or approve the amendment. So you've got to get a lot of states to be willing to do this. Unfortunately, both Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony die before women are ever granted the right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton dies in 1902, and Anthony dies in 1906. And this leaves way for a new generation of women to kind of step in and continue on this fight. So the movement keeps going. Just because they pass away doesn't mean that everything comes to an end. And a lot of young, more educated women, middle-class women, start stepping up and playing a part in the actual role of trying to get the right to vote. So working class women also joined in, not as much because a lot of them had jobs to do and they didn't have the time to always be involved in politics. But they did hope that if they joined the cause and pushed for it, they could get better working conditions for themselves and they would benefit as well. So we start seeing a lot of women join on. So there are two different tactics that are used at this time about trying to push for women's suffrage. One of them was led by this lady right here, Carrie Chapman Catt. She becomes the new leader of the Women's Suffrage Association, and she wants to continue on what the older ladies had done before her, take a careful state-by-state strategy. She wants to be on the good side of the president, who was President Wilson at the time, and even though he wasn't supporting women's suffrage directly, he was like, she was like, I got to get him in my corner. And so she didn't want to push back against the president because she thought that that could be hurtful to the cause. The movement in her mind should also be more ladylike. It should be more refined and should keep that, like, women should still behave as women are supposed to behave so that they don't embarrass the movement. On the other hand, this younger crop of women say, this isn't working. We've been trying this like safe approach and going state by state and being nice and calm for too long, and it's not getting us anywhere. So we need to start taking more drastic action. So this awesome lady right here, Alice Paul, becomes the leader of the National Women's Party and believes in more aggressive strategies. They want to focus not on a state by state basis, but they want to get an amendment passed so that all women have the vote. They adopt unladylike strategies. They heckle politicians. They go and picket in front of the White House. You'll see some of that stuff in your assignment today. They refuse to support Wilson because Wilson isn't supporting them. So they don't mind attacking the president, not like physically attacking, but attacking the president for not supporting them. A lot of their members were arrested. Some of them chained themselves to the fence at the White House. Some of them went on a hunger strike. And when they were arrested, they were horribly, horribly treated. Again, you're going to see that in your assignment today that you're going to do. Eventually, women do see success, and in 1920, we see the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So last year, we celebrated the 100th year that women had the right to vote. Tennessee becomes the 36th state to ratify, and the 19th Amendment is passed. I remember the 19th Amendment by remembering 1-9 lady time. 1-9 lady time. The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States by any state on account of sex. In other words, women are granted suffrage and every woman in the country has the right to vote. So that's the end of the notes. Let me go through and tell you what your assignments are. You've got 2 things to do for your lesson today. The first, I'm not going to click on and open because you know how these work. You've got a women's suffrage ed puzzle. It is a crash course video. It's going to talk about some of the things that I just discussed and reiterate them, and then talk about some other things that would be new. So make sure you're completing that ed puzzle and turning it in. The second task is a quick discussion post. In order to do this discussion post, you're going to open it up, and it's going to ask you, so you can see here, women, this is from a movie, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? And this is Alice Paul and other women going out and protesting in front of the White House to argue against or for women to be able to have the right to vote. So this is from a movie called Iron Jawed Angels, and it's about the fight for women's suffrage. What I want you to do is watch these 2 clips from the movie. They're super short clips. They're not long. They're also pretty interesting. Then you're going to answer these 3 questions in a discussion post below. So you don't have to go through and comment on somebody else's this time. I just need your discussion post. So number 1, you need to react to clip number 1. Tell me, what did you see? What stood out to you? Clip number 2, I need your reaction. Tell me, what did you see? What stood out to you? Number 3, list 1 thing about oppression of women during this time period that you learned about today. So that doesn't necessarily have to come from the videos, but just 1 thing from either your ed puzzle or from this video of me talking to you about your notes. Tell me something that you learned about the oppression of women today. So you're going to answer those 3 and then put that right there. So 2 assignments today, but they're both pretty easy and short and sweet and shouldn't take you too long. I know this was a little bit of a longer video. Make sure that if you're watching the video because you were absent, that after you get done with your assignments, you complete your lesson demonstrated form so that I can make sure to switch your attendance over to present instead of being absent. As always, if you have any question, guys, let me know. You know that I'm here to help you, and I will see you next time. Bye, y'all.